I wasn't looking for buried machinery when I started this investigation. I was researching sewer construction records from the 1850s, routine infrastructure history, the kind of archival work that fills afternoons and produces nothing remarkable. But then I found a discrepancy in the excavation logs for London's Metropolitan Board of Works. A single entry dated March 1858, filed by Chief Engineer Joseph Bazalgette, was immediately superseded by a revised version with different measurements, different depths, and different materials encountered. The original entry described metallic structures of unknown composition encountered at depths inconsistent with any prior human activity. That is the exact phrasing, metallic structures of unknown composition. It was found not at one site, but at 6 separate excavation points spanning 12 miles of tunnel work beneath central London. The revised entry described natural geological deposits. Same engineer, same week, completely different account. That's where the investigation began. Within 3 months, I had collected 23 similar discrepancies from excavation records across 4 countries: London, Paris, Chicago, and St. Petersburg. All came from the same 2-decade window between 1840 and 1865. All featured the same pattern: an original field log documenting unexpected metallic or mechanical structures at depth, and a revised official record replacing that description with something geological, something natural, something that required no further investigation. The scale of the pattern was impossible to dismiss. These weren't the notes of one distracted engineer misidentifying what he saw. They were systematic revisions filed by different men in different countries working for different governments, all arriving at the same correction: natural deposits, nothing to see, move on. I want to be precise about what these original field logs actually describe because the language matters. They don't describe tools, and they don't describe remnants of previous construction. They describe infrastructure, interconnected systems and piping networks at depths far below any known city layer. They detail conduit arrangements running in geometric patterns completely inconsistent with natural formation. In at least 4 documented cases, the engineers describe what they call self-supporting chambers, vaulted spaces with no visible means of construction found sealed beneath layers of undisturbed soil. By all available estimations, these layers dated to well before the cities above them existed. They weren't ruins or debris, they were intact systems. But here is what separates these accounts from ordinary archaeological curiosity, and here is the detail that the revised entries are most careful to remove. Several of the original field logs don't describe passive infrastructure. They describe mechanisms, moving parts, and assemblies of interlocking metal components whose function the engineers could not identify, but whose design they described repeatedly and independently as deliberate and purposeful. The word one Paris engineer uses in an 1853 excavation log, which survives only because a copy was made by his assistant before the original was recalled, is engrenage, or gears. Not gear-shaped rock formations, not naturally occurring metal deposits arranged in a gear-like pattern. Gears. Functional, machined gears with the tooth spacing and bore diameter of components designed to transfer rotational force. They were found at a depth of 31 meters beneath the Marais district, connected to a conduit network extending in 4 directions beyond the range of his excavation. The revised entry for that site described compacted alluvial sediment. This is not a story about pipes. This is a story about machinery, and the machinery was already underground when the Victorians started digging. One engineer working on Chicago's water infrastructure in 1867 wrote in his personal journal, which his family preserved and donated to the Illinois State Historical Society in 1941, that his crew had encountered a horizontal network of bronze conduit running north to south at a depth of 40 feet. He described it as clearly manufactured. He described joints and fittings of a precision his crew could not replicate with available tools. He described the metal as unmarked by corrosion, despite the surrounding soil conditions that had reduced every piece of known historical ironwork in the area to rust within decades. He described in 3 separate journal entries written over 2 weeks of excavation what he called transfer nodes, junctions where the conduit branched and widened, containing internal mechanisms of a type he could not account for with any engineering knowledge available to him. He reported it to his supervising engineer. His next entry, written 8 days later, reads simply, "The superintendent has clarified what we found. I have updated my site records accordingly." He never mentions it again. His site records describe unremarkable clay substrates. This is the pattern. Not one buried mystery in one forgotten city, but a coordinated pattern of discovery and revision spanning a continent and a second one across an ocean simultaneously. The question isn't whether these structures exist. The question is why every government that found them decided within the same 20-year window to pretend they didn't. Let me tell you what was being built above these structures during that window. Between 1840 and 1880, every major Western city undertook what urban historians call the Great Infrastructure Revolution. London's sewer system, Paris's Haussmann renovations, Chicago's street elevation project, New York's Croton water system, and St. Petersburg's canal network. All of them were built simultaneously. All required excavation at extraordinary depth and scale, and all were funded by governments that had, by their own accounts, recently emerged from periods of economic collapse, war, and population disruption. The official narrative frames this as the triumph of industrial ingenuity. Governments saw the need, governments funded the work, engineers designed the systems, workers built them, and cities were transformed. It's a compelling story, but it requires you to ignore several things. It requires you to ignore the construction timelines, which by any rational calculation of available labor, technology, and materials are simply not possible. London's sewer system involved 1,300 miles of brick-lined tunnel completed in 6 years with a workforce that, according to payroll records, numbered in the thousands, not the tens of thousands. Do the arithmetic yourself. It doesn't work. It has never worked, and no historian of civil engineering has ever produced a satisfying explanation for how it was achieved. It requires you to ignore the precision gradients maintained across miles of underground infrastructure with accuracy that modern civil engineers have described in peer-reviewed journals as anomalously precise for the period. Not impressively precise, anomalously precise. And it requires you to ignore the original field logs before the revisions, the ones describing what was actually found when the digging began. Here is what the pattern suggests, and I want to be careful with the word suggest, not prove, not conclude, but suggest. The infrastructure wasn't built during the Victorian era, it was found. The excavations of the 1840s and 1850s weren't digging into virgin soil. They were digging into something already there, something buried, something intact, something that predated the cities above it by an interval no official history is prepared to acknowledge. The engineers found functioning or near-functioning infrastructure, conduit networks, hydraulic systems, mechanical assemblies, drainage and water management architecture of a sophistication matching or exceeding what they were attempting to construct. Rather than investigate what they had found, rather than ask who built it, when, or how, they did something far simpler and far more convenient. They adapted it, connected to it, built their Victorian systems in dialogue with what was already underground, documented the project as original construction, and filed the original field logs away where no one would think to look for another century. That would explain the impossible timelines. You don't need thousands of workers to complete over 1,000 miles of tunnel in 6 years if you're not digging most of it from scratch. You need workers to connect, to extend, and to seal what's already there. It would explain the anomalous precision. You don't need 19th century surveying equipment to maintain perfect gradients across miles of underground infrastructure if those gradients were already established by whoever built the original system. And it would explain the gears, the transfer nodes, and the mechanisms the engineers could not account for. If you're connecting to an existing system, you encounter whatever that system contains. If what it contains is more sophisticated than your own technology, you have two choices. You investigate and ask why, or you revise the entry and move on. They moved on. This raises a question that is simple to ask and extremely difficult to answer. Who built what was found underground? That is where Tartaria becomes impossible to avoid. I want to acknowledge immediately what the response to that word will be. Tartaria is labeled a conspiracy theory, internet speculation,